My work is mainly concerned with language learning in classroom settings, so particularly interested in looking at language learning at points of transition. So in other words, when learners move from one educational level to another. So for example, when they move from primary school to secondary school, or from compulsory language learning to non-compulsory language learning. And that aspect of my work tends to then be explored from two interconnected perspectives. So firstly, I've largely looked at language comprehension, particularly listening comprehension, also more recently reading comprehension, and in relation to issues regarding motivation for language learning, self-regulation for language learning, and self-confidence regarding language learning, but also all those things in relation to attainment for language learning. I can perhaps illustrate that in relation to three recent projects that I've been involved in. The first two funded by the Nuffield Foundation and the last funded by the AHRC. So the first of those Nuffield projects was a study looking at language learning as learners move from primary school to secondary school. And working with colleagues, we tracked around 250 learners from the last 2 years of primary school into the first year of secondary school. And what we were really interested in was how learners' language development progressed in relation to the classroom experiences they had. So in relation to the teaching approach that their teacher used, so for example, whether they focus primarily on oral development or literacy development, and then in relation to things like the teacher's level of French proficiency, the teacher's level of training in teaching languages, and the amount of lesson time that they had. And we looked at the extent to which the effect of those things then carried over into the first year of secondary school. In addition to looking at the impact of those things on learners' attainment, we then also explored it in relation to learners' levels of motivation. And some of the key things that we found from that study was that the teaching approach that the teacher used in the primary school didn't really have any impact on how well learners' vocabulary and grammatical development progress, nor on their levels of motivation. But things that were much more important were the teacher's level of proficiency in French, the amount of lesson time that was devoted to French in the primary school, and perhaps to a lesser extent, the amount of training the teachers had had. And really all those things, the effect of those things carried over into secondary school and in many ways became more pronounced once the learners reached secondary school. So having a teacher in primary school who is well qualified, has a reasonably good level of proficiency in French, and who has been trained are really all important things for helping to ensure that learners get the best possible start to language learning. So in a sense, I think we can say that the study was about finding out what are the ideal conditions for language learning for an early start to language learning, which is, I think, is an important thing to investigate, because globally more and more countries are starting language teaching at a younger age, in the belief that the earlier you start learning a language, the better. I think that's an assumption that is perhaps not borne out by evidence in an instructive context. And what really matters, as much as how old learners are when they learn a language to begin with, is the conditions, the learning conditions to which they're exposed. So that was the first project that I was going to refer to. And then following on from that, in a second project funded by the Nuffield Foundation, we looked at the first year of secondary school again, learning of French again, and at some of the factors that might help learners make the transition into secondary school in relation to reading. So for that study, we implemented an intervention whereby we worked with around about 1,000 learners from approximately 36 schools across all parts of England. And we implemented 3 types of reading comprehension instruction. So the first group that we worked with had instruction in what we might call phonics, so learning how words are sounded out in relation to how they are spelt. The second group of learners received instruction in reading comprehension strategies. So, for example, using the context of what you're reading to help you make sense of the text that you're exposed to. And then the third group we worked with had neither of those types of instruction, but instead worked with the same kinds of texts as the other two groups. So all three groups were exposed to what we consider to be fairly challenging texts, but texts which were quite rich in terms of cultural information and interest for learners. And we looked at the impact of those different types of instruction on learners' reading comprehension, their vocabulary acquisition, and their motivation for and confidence in reading. Interestingly, we found that no one teaching approach led to significantly greater gains in reading, although there was some slight advantage for the phonics group. In terms of confidence in reading, there was an advantage for the group who had been taught to use reading comprehension strategies. And I think from what we found out across those two related findings in one sense was that actually learners need both forms of instruction in order to benefit the most from the interventions that we implemented. So neither phonics on its own nor reading comprehension strategies on their own are perhaps sufficient in order to really help learners to become more proficient readers in French. And the final project that I'm going to be talking about is a project that's ongoing. The other two projects have since finished. Is called Linguistic Creativity in Language Learning, which is part of a broader creative multilingualism project that's being led by Oxford University. So that's a collaborative interdisciplinary project with around about 5 international universities that explores very much the relationship between creativity and language learning. And I'm the project lead for the education strand, which looks at creativity in relation to the learning of French and German in secondary schools. So this time we're working with slightly older learners. They're 14. They're at the point of their education where they're deciding whether to carry on with French or German or not beyond the compulsory stage in England. And what we've done in that project is look at the impact of using literary texts, so in other words poems in French and German, compared with using factual texts, so texts taken from newspapers or magazines, and also looking at the impact of those two different text types used in two different ways. So we've looked at two different teaching approaches again. First of all, looking at the impact of actually using those texts in what we might call a creative way, whereby learners are asked to respond personally, emotionally to the ideas expressed in either the poems or the articles. So that's one teaching approach that we've called the creative teaching approach. And then the second approach is a much more common and usual way of using texts, and that really focuses on the grammatical and vocabulary content of the texts and asks learners to find factual information within them. So we've been exploring the impact of all those different things, so both text types and teaching approaches on learners' ability to read, to write in French or German, the amount of vocabulary that they gain in using those texts, and in relation to their motivation for and beliefs about language learning. We're still in the process of analysing the results from the study. I think one interesting finding that we've found at the moment is that on the whole, for the French group, the creative teaching approaches seem to have been more beneficial for vocabulary learning. But then in relation to writing, we found that while one kind of teaching has helped certain learners considerably more than the other, for other learners the opposite is the case. So what works for one kind of learner doesn't work for another, meaning that we need to really, I think, consider learners very much as individuals, and that we have to have a varied teaching approach to cater for all the different needs that they might have. And I think the final interesting thing that we've found and we've been looking at is actually the impact of these teaching approaches on learners' general creativity. So we've used a test called the abbreviated Torrance test for adults. It's a test of general creativity. And by and large, we've found that learners who experienced or who read the poems, there has been an increase in their levels of general creativity between the beginning and the end of the project, but that hasn't been the case for the learners who just read the factual text. So obviously we need to do more analysis of that, more fine-grained analysis to just find out whether that actually is a correct finding, but that is what we're finding at the moment. So that's potentially very interesting, I think very important, indicating that learning a language under certain conditions in the classroom has positive benefits for one's general creativity, so a benefit beyond the ability to speak another language.